There is a question asked constantly across the Muslim world, in mosques, in living rooms, and in the comment sections of every major news outlet. It is a question that rarely receives a straight answer. If Islamic teaching places such enormous weight on justice and standing against oppression, how do some of the most powerful Muslim-majority governments maintain open diplomatic and economic relationships with the state accused of carrying out that treatment? For many, the contradiction is found right here. They see the evidence of suffering in the Palestinian territories and compare it against the ongoing diplomatic actions of their own leaders. This tension is one of the most uncomfortable fault lines in the modern Middle East. It is an honest, unresolved argument about what it actually means to be a modern Muslim state. Egypt is the oldest case. In 1979, Anwar Sadat signed a peace treaty with Israel, becoming the first Arab leader to formally recognize the state. It was so controversial that Egypt was suspended from the Arab League for a decade, and Sadat was eventually assassinated by militants who viewed the treaty as a betrayal. Since then, Egypt has maintained security cooperation that includes helping enforce the blockade on Gaza. By restricting movement at the Rafah crossing, the Egyptian government chooses to keep one of the only gateways out of Gaza largely closed, in coordination with Israel. Then there is the UAE. In 2020, they signed the Abraham Accords, normalizing relations through tech partnerships and direct flights and defense cooperation. These weren't quiet, deniable talks. They were framed publicly as a new era of Gulf-Israeli partnership, with business conferences and glossy state visits taking place, while Palestinian casualty figures dominated the headlines. The treaties create a situation where official state policy and regional reality seem to occupy different worlds entirely, leaving ordinary citizens to reconcile the two. To understand the anger, we have to look at the religious argument. In Islamic scripture, standing against oppression, or zulm, is a core obligation rather than an optional virtue. The Quran repeatedly commands the faithful to support those who are oppressed. There is also a well-known prophetic teaching that the best form of jihad is speaking a word of truth in front of a tyrannical ruler. Critics argue this applies directly here, framing cooperation with perceived oppression as a significant moral failure. This extends into the concept of eschatology, the belief that accountability doesn't end at death. In this framework, leaders will one day stand before God and answer for their political and moral choices. For those making this argument, normalizing relations isn't a foreign policy choice. It's a choice with implications far beyond this life, one they believe the leadership will ultimately have to answer for. But the governments themselves argue from a completely different framework, the realist calculus of statecraft. Egypt's leadership maintains that their 1979 treaty ended decades of catastrophic wars that killed enormous numbers of Egyptians. They argue that maintaining current security arrangements is a matter of managing militant threats in the Sinai, not indifference to suffering. The UAE and other Gulf states point to shared concerns about Iran, the need for economic diversification, and access to advanced defense systems. They argue that state survival and personal piety operate in different domains entirely. Within this realist lens, these alliances are viewed as necessary buffers, unpleasant but required to prevent national or economic collapse. It is a common mistake to assume Islamic scholarship is unanimous on this. In reality, the religious establishment is fractured. Many respected scholars draw a sharp distinction between a government's security choices and an individual's personal accountability. They argue that treaties and pragmatic survival fall under a distinct legal and ethical framework. Other scholars even defend engagement, arguing that diplomatic channels create leverage for ceasefire negotiations that isolation cannot. This leaves ordinary citizens without a unified moral directive, as the religious authorities themselves cannot agree. This creates a widening gap between the closed-door diplomacy of the elites and the religious convictions of the public they lead. Polling consistently shows that public sentiment is far more sympathetic to Palestinians than these formal state policies suggest. This contradiction turns domestic spaces into ideological battlegrounds. The state's silence resonates as a betrayal to those reading scripture through the lens of mandatory solidarity. This internal friction creates a pressure cooker at home, where an unpopular foreign policy begins to undermine a government's own domestic standing. Neither the demands of spiritual accountability nor the requirements of geopolitical survival can fully dismantle the other. Until this underlying conflict is resolved, the gap between what many believe faith demands and what governments calculate survival requires will remain the most volatile argument in the Muslim world.